So let's talk through every epic hero and named character in the core Codex Space Marines and how to go about fielding them in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about epic heroes of the Space Marines, going through each of the named characters from the Codex and a few thoughts on battle plans. This one's a bit of a follow-up part 2 of my How to Field Space Marine Units video, which we did last week. In that one I talked through options for the infantry vehicles and generic characters, so for this one we're going to talk through the chapter specific stuff from the core Space Marine Codex. For this one I thought we'd just do a broad brush overview of some of the biggest strengths of the various character datasheets, a few good support options for squads and transports, how I'd be most tempted to use them in battle at the moment, and a very rough sort of power level in game, either usable, weak or strong. Though for this one I more wanted to focus on making each character work as opposed to just saying probably don't use that one on things. Obviously it's going to be a slightly broad brush overview given how many detachments and options these guys have with how to field them, and feel free to let me know if you've got any other good ways to make them work in game down in the comments. Jumping straight into it, and we'll start out with the Ultramarines. Rebute Guilliman, the Primarch himself, is a pretty relevant unit at the moment, getting a big points cut down to 285. And the main things that his datasheet is good for is just really big melee power, the choice of two very powerful buffs between multiple turns worth of free stratagems or double oath of moment and one situational objective control boost, and being really quite hard to take down between being a lone operative with big stats and his resurrection rule. For supporting him with other units, as really quite a big central character with enormous buffs, is likely going to be going into an army list that's got him in mind quite heavily. Perhaps a gun line that plans to make good use out of his double oath, or certain units that will get really good mileage out of his free stratagems. And it's kind of interesting to see his discounted stratagems on really quite big chunky units that otherwise wouldn't normally be able to access them. It means he can be weirdly good in Ironstorm Spearhead and giving things like, say, Repulsor Executioners -1 to use that big damage stratagem, for example, or getting vehicle units free Armour of Contempt in the Strike Back. In general, he's pretty much going to want some infantry around to make sure that he can play at least fairly aggressively and not just be gunned down by enormous firepower at long range. You could have units hiding out of line of sight, or you could synergise with Tech Marines or a Combi Weapon Lieutenant to give you sort of lone operatives protecting other lone operatives. Otherwise, just a bunch of fairly durable Marines of one sort or another could do fine. Then beyond that, it's going to be a massively focal unit for any synergies that you can use on him. Things like Heroic Intervention, Epic Challenge, Armour of Contempt, or just about any damage, defense or movement shenanigan that will apply to him well. It's going to be dead efficient here on 285 points worth of melee might. For using in game, you're likely going to have some sort of plan for what you mainly want to use him for, but each turn you should still probably weigh up whether or not you're going to be going for the double oath if the opponent's got multiple big tough units to try and take out, and you think that you've actually got enough firepower to wipe out the first to make the second one relevant, or whether it's going to be more valuable to use those extra stratagems. The +1 OC and Battle Shock one I think is far lower value, but if there's game-winning victory points at stake, and you've got units that could fail Battle Shock to deny them, then I still wouldn't completely discount it as an option. In general, beyond that though, for his game plan, he just needs to be treated as the big central character that he is, make sure that he's not being shot to death between his lone operative and maybe some use of terrain as needed, push him up cautiously towards the mid-board, probably at least getting a couple of good turns of his maximal buffs going on your units, and then probably think about committing to melee in the mid-game, taking down some big enemy threats with the Emperor's Sword or the Hand of Dominion. He's particularly good at going through things like standard issue Space Marines with the Emperor's Sword, and should be able to put a massive amount of damage on the heaviest stuff around. Potentially, if it makes sense as well, and he's nearing death anyway, you could potentially gamble him on playing aggressive and having a good chance to stand up on a 3+. That's only going to work 2/3 of the time though, so it's kind of massive, and I think you'd only want to do that if there was a good chance he was going to die anyway. If the opponent can't both shoot him down and then charge him in melee, you do know that there's a pretty good chance that he's going to have at least one more turn of acting though, which could be kind of big knowing that he's got a good chance of essentially being almost invincible for a turn. In general though, I'd say you just don't want to wind up with him as the only model left in your army at the end of the game because he's not played aggressive enough, and the opponent's just had free reign to take down everything else. Overall, he's looking far better after the points cut. I say sort of in the usable to strong sort of bracket, though has stiff competition from the other good Ultramarine datasheets. Next up we have the Chapter Master of the Ultramarines himself, Marneus Calgar. He's 185 points and comes with his Victrix Honor Guards. His primary benefits are generating command points, having a massive movement boost to his unit with advance and fallback and shoot and charge in any combo. So basically his unit will have a far bigger threat range and not care about being locked up, and he just makes a very chunky sort of Death Star style unit between his own stats and Victrix Guards. So you can have weirdly big Space Marine units like squads of 9 or 10 if attached to a Blade Guard or Aggressor unit. I say that in general they're normally going to be the first picks for him to use. They're dangerous high value elites that can make good use out of his extra threat range as they move kind of slowly. And I'll quite enjoy the fact that his Victrix Honor Guards can tank big shots for them, particularly for the aggressors with their 4+ invulnerable saves. You can take saves on them before you take saves on the aggressors if you want to. Otherwise, Assault Intercessors, Eradicators, and Company Heroes can also work. Assault Intercessors are cheap and can get big rerolls. Company Heroes gives you a somewhat lower investment but still very dangerous and hard to take out brawler unit. And Eradicators can be an interesting both range and melee threat, with Calgar and his guards doing enough to make them scary in melee. And they can fall back, shoot their melter guns, and then charge back in if they're not destroyed. Compared with some other Space Marines, he might have a bit more preference for foot slogging as opposed to running in a Land Raider, given that he'll only generate command points if he's not in a transport, and being able to advance and charge and advance and shoot all the time makes delivery a bit less of a problem. I'd say you still certainly could run him that way if you wanted to, and he can make his big combo squad even more dangerous by adding in either a lieutenant or an apothecary biologist. You could have his units with infiltrating in the vanguard detachment. He's often run there with aggressors or other stuff, or you could make him the fire discipline unit in Gladius if you wanted to with a bunch of aggressors. In general, if he is attaching to something big and scary, it's just going to be an enormous high investment damage and defense unit that's going to be great for efficiency for any stratagems or synergies that you can use on them. As a result, such a high value unit needs to be played with really quite carefully. It potentially could be game over if they get destroyed before they manage to do a serious amount of damage. Ideally, they'd want to make very good use of terrain, maybe moving into a ruin in the midfield so the opponent has to worry about approaching them. But if they don't, then the midfield objectives will be yours. And then in an ideal world, they want to use the advance and charge to move out, do a full round of shooting, and then charge something important and destroy something at the heart of the enemy army. Armour of Contempt and any reactive moves for your detachment could then be really big for trying to keep them safe in return. Overall, he's another very strong character in Codex Space Marines, and is really commonly seen in competitive lists between his big utility and his free command points. Before we move on, I thought I'd just quickly give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, in Weyland Yutani terrain. They're one option that's available for some functional competitive style Warhammer 40k terrain, able to get some practical ruins on the board, and these guys make and supply terrain for the WTC, the biggest and most prestigious 40k team tournament in the world. The terrain's made from some lightweight but fairly sturdy plastic, fairly hard wearing as it goes and comes pre-printed, so you don't need to do any hobby effort for these. They can even go together without glue, so it can be a bit faster to get some functional terrain on the tabletop that looks alright, if you don't have the time needed to create an entire board worth of fully painted plastic terrain. Here's a few examples of their offerings. It's $150 or £120 or €140 for basically an entire table worth of terrain, which is certainly a lot cheaper than most of Games Workshop's offerings, and maybe a little bit cheaper than certain other options like MDF as well. Might be kind of close there. They've got one aimed for the WTC Pariah Nexus setup. There's one with a bigger focus on the really big ruins, including some 3-sided ones. And they do have smaller listings as well, such as this set of 4 3-story ruins. Could just be good if you want some good quality line of sight blocking terrain to add to another table perhaps. In any case, feel free to check them out linked in the video description. There's a code Auspex5 for 5% off, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through a few more pros and cons for those interested. Back to the Space Marine characters though, and next up we have Uriel Ventris, already great and got even better. His special rule grants a unit Deep Strike, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the unit that he's leading. He's a cheap captain at 75 points with a fairly standard melee loadout, and then he's just gained a command point debuff aura as well, which is really quite a powerful rule to add in with the rest. Enemy units within 12 inches have to pay an extra command point when they're spending stratagems. Basically for his data sheet he both needs a unit to put Deep Strike on and then a unit to lead, and it doesn't usually make sense to Deep Strike him, so it's best to put that on other things. In general, for the Deep Strike option, I tend to go for something shooting as opposed to melee. You could do interesting things like melee and rapid ingress, with say things like Assault Centurions perhaps, but it almost feels a little bit unnecessary to expend the extra resource and make things complicated when there's plenty of good shooting options. For more general purpose use, things like Eradicators are kind of fine. They wouldn't be getting into melter range with the Deep Strike, but just getting in range of a tank full stop is a really efficient use of firepower from them. You could use things like the Fire Discipline combo, maybe on Eradicators, maybe on Hellblasters from Gladius, though he's best known for using it with Devastator Centurions, great big scary walking gun turrets, and using them with the Vanguard Spearhead. A unit of 6 of them can demolish a whole bunch of targets in the game between rockets and las cannons, and then with the return to reserve stratagem you can then deep strike them somewhere else, so they can effectively warp around the table, blowing things to bits, with the combo of him and the Vanguard strat. Then for Ventris personally, I've most commonly seen people either using him with company heroes or assault intercessors. Both of those are cheapish, toughish units that can scrap with the enemy in the midboard. The assault intercessors are cheaper and their rerolls are nice, and the company heroes are tankier with their bigger stat lines and -1 to wound. You could maybe put one of those squads in an impulsor if you really wanted to, though I don't think it's really 100% necessary. For his battle plan, the thing that's deep striking is likely to be deployed off the board, dropping in to put down the herd. Centurions in Vanguard could start on the board and go back into reserves for the stratagem if you wanted. Then his own foot-slogging unit should likely move up to scrap with enemies on the mid-board objectives, being at least somewhat expendable, and mainly wanting to put his melee things to good use and push up the board and be a bit more aggressive. Now he's got that command point debuff, which can be an enormous spanner in the works with the opponent's plans sometimes, and again favours him playing aggressively and getting up in the opponent's grill. Overall, he's a very easy include for Ultramarines right now, I certainly rate him very strong. Next up, we've got Chief Librarian Tigurius, 75 points, and I'd argue that he does quite a lot on a number of fronts for that. Perhaps most impressive is his fairly big hitting shooting at 18 inches with the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath, plus some fairly helpful general purpose melee to add on to his squad as well. Beyond that, he also gives a -1 to hit for his unit and defense against mortal wounds and certain free stratagems including Heroic Intervention and Overwatch. Between his own stat line and his special rules, he feels like he's kind of viable for a whole bunch of different units really. Sternguard synergise with the shooting and could make good use of his Overwatch. Intercessors are cheaper and won't shoot as hard and come with their special rule. Assault Intercessors are even cheaper and could actually make his melee fairly scary with the reroll wounds. There'd be an odd sort of mixed role shooting and then close combat unit. Blade Guard could do similar, and even Devastators could be interesting enough, potentially helping him shoot down some tougher things, and also being particularly good for Overwatch. Given that he will be adding a fair bit more damage to the unit, but maybe not quite as much defense, he seems pretty reasonable to get an Impulsor, or maybe riding a Razorback if he's with Devastator squads. For his overall battle plan, his combined unit is going to be at least somewhat fragile and a sort of mid-range damage dealer, with both a bit of range and melee threat. He's likely going to want to try and skirmish with sort of enemy medium infantry, things like enemy Space Marines seem particularly nice, or perhaps enemy Terminators. Ideally, if him and his chosen squad can get into the midboard, get the jump on some infantry with their shooting, and then either follow up with a charge against something, or set up somewhere for some good Overwatch, that's probably going to go a long way to recouping their investment. You could try and do some big brain things like trying to declare the Oath target and use that to inflict yet more pain with Overwatch and reroll everything that isn't sixes. That might not be quite as good as declaring it on something that you're actually focusing with the whole bunch of your army in your turn. Overall, I feel like he's got a lot going for him, that just doesn't really tend to amp up the actual power of his squad that much. It's more just there alongside. I'd say he's solidly usable, though it doesn't seem to get used anywhere near as much as the other Ultramarines in competitive lists. Finally, for the boys in blue, we have Cato Sicarius. He grants scouts to his unit, the assault keyword with shooting, and reactive moves for a unit of a big guaranteed 6 inches. In general, I would have rated him kind of usable to weak, though admittedly given that someone managed to win a tournament with him with Ultramarines Vanguard, he's looking a bit less weak than he was. Beyond that though, I've not really seen a lot of people choosing to use him in competitive lists for the entirety of the rest of 10th edition. He definitely has some good stuff, probably that reactive move being the single biggest thing, but he is competing against a lot of other good options in the Codex. Again, like Tigurius, I feel like he's got a lot of credible units that he could lead, maybe company heroes, assault intercessors and blade guard, perhaps being the most obvious ones due to the assault focus, given that he's got some okay melee in himself. It looks like he was with company heroes in an Impulsor in that tournament winning list, able to scout into the midfield and then could play games on midfield objectives. The automatic 6-inch reactive move could be enough to swoop him onto the other side of ruins and stop the enemy from shooting him. That's been my general game plan, to scrap that sort of way on the midboard objectives, potentially punishing the enemy that try and move up to destroy him by fading away behind ruins and then counter-attacking in turn. Ideally, with his own damage output and the units that he can join, he's likely to want to try and take out sort of Space Marine level targets or weaker. He's going to be a little bit underwhelming against anything tougher than that. He definitely could be an annoying unit to deal with though. Moving on, next we've got the White Scars and Korsarro Khan. He is 70 points. So as a cheap character that's a fairly good character killer, he's got alright melee with devastating wounds and precision built in, and if he happens to kill a character, you also generate 1 command point, which isn't unhelpful. Then for his unit, he gives them the assault keyword and the lance keyword, so +1 to wound on the charge, which I say is the bigger thing versus the advance and shoot. With that combination, he wants to go with something melee, Again, probably Blade Guard, Assault Intercessors, or Company Heroes would be my choices. All of those can get good value out of his own melee stat lines, plus the advance. I guess the assault keyword might not hurt for being able to advance and shoot pistols if you're in one of the detachments that can advance and charge, maybe Gladius or the White Scar's appropriate Stormlance. You could put a Lieutenant in there as well to further amp up the damage output against really tough stuff. I feel like that could be reasonable if he was going with Blade Guard. Between Lance and lethal hits, you'd have really quite a general purpose melee killer there. And the whole thing could be delivered in an Impulsor or Land Raider. And definitely do that if you don't have an advance and charge option in the detachment that is being run in. I feel like his role in life is going to be fairly simple and effective. Move up to the midboard and try and threaten an objective, and ideally try and take out something that's a big important unit in the enemy army with a whole bunch of damage 2 attacks. Compared with some characters, that Lance keyword really means he wants to do the charging and not be charged if possible, whether it's jumping out of a transport or advancing and charging. And if he gets a complete choice of what to go after, it's probably going to be sort of medium infantry led by characters if you've got that option. At 70 points I think he's very usable. They maybe not stand out amazing for the points, and a lot of the other core Codex chapters do have the downside that if you take someone like Korsarro Khan, you're basically not taking any other chapter unique stuff whatsoever, as the White Scars only have him as an option. Next up we've got Ironfather Feirros, a Forge Master of the Iron Hands. He's got a fairly respectable melee stat line between the Great Big Axe and a couple of servo arm hits. He grants a 5+ Feel No Pain to his lead unit and gets a boosted Blessing of the Omnissiah for +3 wounds and a +1 to hit for a vehicle within 3 inches. To justify his fairly big 95 point cost, I think you need to make good use out of both the Feel No Pain and the vehicle buff and his melee stats at some point in the game. The Feel No Pain is likely going to be best with heavy intercessors in my opinion. I feel like if you're investing the big points in eradicators or aggressors, they're going to kind of need to justify themselves by getting the first strike on the enemy and playing kind of cagey, whereas heavy intercessors are tough enough just to stomp up the board alongside some tanks and vehicles and let Feirros heal and buff their damage. You get a very sturdy unit to remove with him and 5 heavy intercessors with the Feel No Pain, and could be a good option to use Armour of Contempt on if anything goes after them. Then beyond that, he likely wants to pair with a vehicle that he can buff well, something that hits on a 3+ for the damage buff and isn't going to be killed outright so he gets to heal it. Things like a Repulsor Executioner, Redemptor Dreadnought and Vindicators could be nice enough. He probably doesn't want to be in a transport vehicle himself due to wanting to use his own abilities in the command phase. I'd also say that you don't really want to just run him solo, as other Tech Marines might want to do out there, given that they're just really quite cheap and efficient at 55 points for that role. I'd take them if running solo, and Feirros I think really needs to use that Feel No Pain and his melee stat line to justify himself. Broadly speaking, I'd have those heavy intercessors stomp up the board alongside some dreadnoughts or tanks, help out their damage and patch them up with 3 wounds restored each turn, and then in the mid to late game commit to fighting over the mid-board objectives. He can bully some medium infantry with his own attacks, and just forcing the opponents to deal with Feel No Pain heavy intercessor stat line is going to take up at least a little bit of their damage. Plus they do have good OC, and with Feirros around they're not going to be a pushover in melee as much as they normally are. I'd say used in that way he's pretty usable, though I feel like you do maybe need to do a slightly awkward amount of building around him to make him work. Next up we've got the Shadow Master of the Raven Guard in Kayvaan Shrike. He's 100 points for a jump Phobos unit. His big thing is giving lone operative style protection for a jump unit, so they can't be shot outside of 12 inches. Plus he's got some fairly strong twin-linked melee with precision, and the option to return his unit to reserve if it makes sense. You could run him solo as an interesting lone operative, though I feel like to get the most out of him, it kind of makes sense to extend that lone operative protection to a great big scary jump unit, probably to my mind usually 10 jump intercessors or vanguard veterans. I think both of which are fairly justifiable depending on whether or not you want the extra investment. I don't think it'd be outright wrong to field a 5-man unit though. That'd still give you a small and pretty useful and dangerous lone operative style squad. Otherwise you could get on pretty well with Gladius, that's to be able to advance and charge, do reactive moves, and having a lance melee stratagem is pretty big for a Shrike unit. I think weirdly he gains a fair bit more here than his own Vanguard. For a game plan I'd likely deploy on the board given the immunity from being shot at long range, then probably move up cautiously, making sure that the opponent isn't going to get the big jump on you with something like a deep strike unit or something that can charge a long way, and he can still move up behind terrain even if he does have lone operative. Then hopefully try and eliminate outlying enemy threats where he's not going to hit back too hard before maybe being a lot more aggressive and try and take out something central later on. At the end of each turn you could consider whether or not returning to reserves is going to be a better option than his on the board position. If he's actually wanting to charge something the next turn though, then often the on the board position might just be overall better, particularly after you've done a 12-inch move and maybe an advance and charge if you have the option for it in your detachment. I feel like his overall unit's going to be really quite a big power piece that could absolutely be played in very different intelligent ways against different opponents. It will be quite a lot of points investment, and given the lone operative style protection, it's definitely got scope for a whole load of shenanigans, and staying safe-ish when it does damage. You could play very differently versus different enemies, and definitely could be a good option for any damage and defense stratagems that have going, either hitting it very hard when it jumps out of the shadows to deal some big melee damage, or using Armour of Contempt or something to make them unusually hard to kill if the opponent does get the jump on them. Overall I'd rate him very strong currently. Next up we've got the Imperial Fists, and we're starting off with Tor Garadon. His thing is really quite big personal damage against monsters, vehicles and fortifications. He gets extra AP, strength and damage against them, and it means that his melee is pretty massive with AP 4 and damage 4, and even his grav gun can be legitimately threatening, with a couple of shots at anti-vehicle 2+, AP 3 and damage 4 there as well. He also grants ignores cover for his unit as well, which is handy enough, though he does miss his lethal hits that he had at the start of 10th. For units to lead, it feels like aggressors seem like the single best fit for him perhaps. The Boltstorm and Fragstorm would certainly enjoy the ignores cover with their kind of lowish AP, and they'd happily back him up in melee, maybe being a little bit more efficient against more elite infantry, where he can deal a bit of much needed damage against the really tough stuff. Heavy Intercessors and Eradicators both could be fine though, given his buffs and the rest of the stuff that he does. I feel like given his focus on close range damage, he likely wants a transport to get him into effective range. Maybe a Land Raider or Repulsor would be a good choice. You could maybe pair him with an Apothecary Biologist for lethal hits and enhancement access. You could do Fire Discipline or Infiltrate depending on the detachment. It does seem kind of funny that a command point reroll of a wound roll of 1 on that grav gun could actually be weirdly good against vehicles. A fairly reasonable chance to get an extra damage 4 attack there if he did fail to wound with 1. He's got a profile that will make quite good use of the Ironstorm rerolls I suppose too. In general I think his battle plan would be fairly simple, wanting to get his melee profile and grav gun into the biggest scariest monsters and vehicles around, likely deploying safe in a transport, using it to get in range, and then a full turn of shoot and charging if you can. For the 90 points, I feel like he's just maybe a little bit on the usable to weak sort of side of things. His personal melee damage really isn't bad at all, though just quite specific into certain targets. If you play against say an elite infantry or a more horde style list without too many vehicles that he can get his hands on, it's going to add quite a bit less than some of the other characters that you could have taken. Also for the Imperial Fist we have Darnath Lysander for 100 points. A great big indomitable Terminator with Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. It's got big personal damage from a strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 hammer with devastating wounds. He makes his Terminator squad unusually tanky with a -1 to wound when they're shot by things that are strength 6 or higher, and also has a single phase of a 2+ invulnerable for him personally, which could mean that he basically guarantees to live through any one phase, provided that you realise he's in danger and call this early enough. I feel like he's probably overall the best fit with Assault Terminators with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields alongside himself. They're already pretty tanky and went down in points recently, and getting a further -1 to wound on the entire unit is a pretty big deal. Depending on their opponent's army and your own detachment, I feel like you could potentially start them on the board and just foot slog up towards central objectives. I think that's more viable if you have an advance and charge option, but otherwise Deep Strike seems sensible enough against most of them. Rapid Ingress is a pretty nice way to near guarantee a charge. He could be hiding behind terrain before that, but if he's leading a Terminator squad with 4 wounds apiece and -1 to wound, it's probably going to be pretty credible just to drop him with his squad right in the open. Feels like there's several good options for getting him to the fight depending on what the opponent's army is. Deep Strike does seem very tempting though, with the possibility of Rapid Ingress, or potentially doing a slightly Hail Mary 9-inch charge, where you still have around about a 50% chance of that succeeding with a command point reroll, and sometimes that could be kind of game changing just to get that straight out of reserves. He'd ideally want to be going for some of the toughest targets in the enemy army, toughness 10 or lower if he can manage it, but if not, that's no big deal. If he can coordinate so his Terminator squad winds up ending melee or deep striking onto an objective, that's all well and good, given they're just so tough to remove that the opponent might not bother. And as he's going about the board, you'd have to be on the lookout for the phase in which he's likely to actually be threatened for some personal damage and trigger his invulnerable save early. As you can't do it when his unit's attacked, it has to be at the start of the phase. Overall, I'd rate him as solidly usable for the Imperial Fists. Next up, we've got Pedro Kantor, the hero of the Crimson Fists. he gets a fairly punchy damage 3 power fist, a fairly solid round of storm bolter shooting that fires like a heavy bolter basically, a single +1 to your attacks buff that both works for range and melee once per game, and then a damage buff to the units that gets better as they take more casualties. Between all that, I feel like he's got just a fairly solid general purpose stat line for 90 points that maybe isn't the single most obvious as to what single battlefield role he's going to be committed to. I feel like for his support options, likely either Blade Guard or Stern Guard would probably be the best fit. That +1 attack buff is really meaningful on both of those, and he'll chip in solidly himself with his own stats at range and melee as well. Flat damage 3 on the power fist is particularly nice. I think company heroes could also work very nicely as well for a cheaper skirmish squad. 180 points for some fairly tanky space marines that might well survive and trigger his damage buffs. He does maybe have a bit of unfortunate anti-synergy with transport in that he can't trigger his special rule when he's embarked on them, and that could be a kind of big deal, and it's maybe a bit annoying seeing as they would have been one of the better ways to get him there. Overall, as a bit of an all-rounder Space Marine character with a bit of shooting, a bit of melee, and some damage buffs, I think his battle plan's going to depend quite a lot on his lead unit. He could be charging out of a Land Raider with some Blade Guard and a Lieutenant attached maybe, or could be marching up from behind terrain with a unit of Stern Guard and then triggering the +1 attacks bonus for some pretty serious devastating wounds firepower, maybe combined with Oath of Moment. In general, I'd be tempted to use his +1 attacks boost the first time that he makes contact with the enemy, just to make sure it definitely does get used. Like a lot of them, I feel like as a sort of big damage and defensive sort of combo guy, his main challenge is getting the damage on the enemy before they attack him in turn. Overall, I'd say he's usable enough. Having the flat damage 3 is quite a bonus for him. In general, he's not really quite seen as strong enough to have people seeking him out to run the Crimson Fist in particular, particularly as he locks out any other options. Next up, we've got Adrax Agatone of the Salamanders. He's 85 points and also has some pretty big hitting melee, a bunch of strength 10 AP 2 damage 3 with a good torrent pistol. He rerolls wounds in melee for both him and his unit, and he disrupts an enemy objective control a bit while locked in combat with things. For units for him to lead, it does feel like Blade Guard are probably the single best choice by a fair way. They just work really nicely with the reroll wounds boost that he has, which is pretty good on strength 5 weapons, and he could also throw a Lieutenant into the unit as well, which would both be good for the lethal hits for yet more wounds, plus the Lieutenant can make use of Adrax's own wound rerolls as well, and it could be a way to get enhancements into the unit if he wanted to. Depending on the exact combo, you could have him charging out of a Land Raider or Impulsor. I think I'd be kind of tempted by Blade Guard and a Land Raider myself. I guess perhaps a Redeemer if you're going full Salamanders maybe. And then anything else that can buff his damage and defense as a big central combo is going to be very nice. Maybe things like Crucible of Battle, the Gladius extra AP and Lance stratagem, or the enhancement that can go on the Lieutenant in the Firestorm to make some automatic 6s happen. My plan would be to have him charge out of transports against the biggest, scariest enemy threat around. If he can have some sort of damage dealing stratagem to support him, he should have a good chance of one-shotting a whole bunch of tough stuff in the game, and hopefully wants to hit something important as opposed to enemy chaff. I guess the objective control could give him a bit more reliability at swiping an objective from certain enemy units that you're not guaranteed to take out in turn. Overall, I think he's really quite strong for the Salamanders, kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Finally, we've got Vulkan Hestan, who's 100 points for the Sons of Nocturne. He gets some Captain-style melee with an even more savage Torrent Gauntlet. His big buffing rule is to mark a target for full rerolls to wound with Melter or Torrent weapons, and then he gets OC10 when he's on a central objective, plus gaining a 4+ feel no pain personally. Multiple options could be usable, though he seems kind of made to go with the company heroes. They're nice and tough and can march up with him to the midboard and then hopefully survive there and put his big objective control to work, and it won't compromise him on marking targets for other units with the Melter and Flamer rerolls. Otherwise, Assault Intercessors for cheap and their wound rerolls could do well, or Infernus Marines, given that they can benefit from his buff. Otherwise, the Land Raider Redeemer really likes his buffing rule, and he potentially could charge out of it himself as he gets to declare the rule in the shooting phase, so he could potentially have the Land Raider move up and disembark him before telling what the rerolls are going to be. And otherwise, for buffing targets, it could pair nicely with Infernus Marines. You could have a squad arrive via a drop pod or repulsor maybe, and then get full reroll wounds with their flamers on one target, maybe even with the devastating wound stratagem from the Firestorm if desires. Otherwise, it's still relevant for Eradicators who appreciate the rerolls against elite infantry, or maybe multi-melter Devastators. Overall, in general, he's going to want to stay hidden initially, then move up the board onto a mid-board point and coordinate the advance with very scary Melter or Flamer units to make their damage output far better. He certainly makes the Flamestorm cannons of a Land Raider Redeemer get completely next level. Overall, I'd say here's a fairly usable to strong datasheet for the Codex Space Marines, a pretty nice central one to build around and definitely helps out on the midboard too. In any case, with the Salamanders talked about, that just about brings us to the end of talking some game plans for the various Space Marine epic heroes. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below on the use of them. Finally, I'll just cycle back to talk a bit more about today's video sponsor, Weyland Yutani Terrain, one option for some fairly practical competitive style battlefields. For some of their pros and cons, I feel like this is really terrain that lends itself towards the more sort of practical side of putting functional terrain on the table, as opposed to necessarily going out to be the very prettiest out there, though I still think it looks nice enough. The ruins all block line of sight well, have got good defined footprints, thin walls so it's easy to put things in the bases, and fairly lightweight so aren't going to damage models too much if you say knock them over or need to move things around. They do competitive style terrain layouts given that they literally make the supplies for the WTC. As mentioned earlier, they come pre-coloured and go together without glue. You get to choose from a bunch of colour options, and they can be stored flat as well. They might take a little bit of time to disassemble and reassemble as needed. The cost is certainly far cheaper than Games Workshop, though you could say that about quite a few other terrain systems. This one feels at least kind of comparable to MDF, maybe a little bit cheaper for a full table worth of terrain. Probably the main trade-off for these is maybe a little bit of theming and narrative feel sort of things. They don't have much texture besides the things printed on, and they do have the sort of like white edges on display that you can see here. Not exactly the biggest deal in the world, and they do look fairly polished and refined, but definitely going to appeal to some wargamers more so than others. I feel like maybe having a balance of things like this and some other terrain pieces with a bit more texture and adding interest with some statues and things maybe could make a fairly good balanced battlefield. In any case, feel free to check out the things linked down in the video description. This one's one of their more standard full 40k boards. 4 big ruins, 6 smaller ruins, and a few Munitorum style crates. There's the code Auspex5 for 5% off in the video description. They've got their Pariah Nexus terrain pack where they've got some good big ruins, a couple of smaller ones, and then some sort of foresty counts as type things, maybe representing some girders poking out of the ground or something. And then their set of 4 3-story ruins, £50 or $65 plus shipping, for some fairly effective line of sight blockers. I feel like these could be quite a good addition to a lot of tables, just guaranteeing that there's at least a fair bit of good line of sight blocking on the table at bare minimum. They're big and wide enough to hide things like Imperial Knights. In any case, a big thanks to them for sponsoring the video. There'll be links down in the video description. I've certainly seen their terrain around quite a lot at tournaments that I've played at. It is pretty effective. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Feel free to let me know any thoughts as to the Space Marine characters down in the comments, and subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, or certainly have more for the Astartes. If you'd like to support the channel, there's the Patreon page and the 40k discount affiliate links in the video description as well. A big thank you to any folks using those, but otherwise I'll be back for another video in the not too distant future, so I'll hope to see you then. A massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you next time.